It started with a door I forgot to knock on. It was late, well past 11 p.m., and the house was silent, except for the hum of the central air. I'd been heading upstairs to bed, carrying a basket of folded towels, when I noticed light spilling out from the half-open bathroom door. I assumed Cole, my stepson, had left it on by mistake. He's always been careless like that. A bit scatterbrained, forever leaving lights on, dishes in the sink, and his laundry in piles. But when I pushed the door open, ready to call him out for wasting electricity, I froze. He was there, sitting on the edge of the tub, shirtless, his sweatpants pushed down around his thighs. The water was running, steaming up the mirrors, but he wasn't bathing. His hand was gripping himself, his face turned toward the ceiling, eyes half closed. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was to slam the door and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But my body betrayed me. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as if I couldn't quite process what was happening. He didn't notice me at first. The soft groans slipping from his lips, the slow rhythm of his hand, he was completely lost in his own world. And then, he saw me. His head snapped toward the doorway, his eyes locking onto mine in a split second of stunned silence. He stammered, scrambling to cover himself with a towel. His face turned crimson, his voice thick with embarrassment. "Sorry," I blurted, spinning around so fast I nearly dropped the towels. My heart was hammering as I fled down the hallway, leaving the door ajar behind me. I didn't stop until I was in my bedroom, the basket forgotten on the floor. My hands were shaking as I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing pulse. But I couldn't get the image out of my head. The flush of his skin, the sheer vulnerability of the moment. I told myself it was nothing. Just an awkward situation, a fluke. But even as I tried to push it from my mind, I felt a warmth spreading through me, something dark and unfamiliar. And that was the beginning. The next morning I told myself I'd imagined it, or at least exaggerated it in my mind. Maybe it hadn't been as intense as I remembered. Maybe I'd only caught the briefest glimpse, and my tired brain filled in the rest. That's what I told myself as I fixed my hair in the bathroom mirror, brushing through the streaks of gray that I'd stopped dyeing last year. Walter had already left for work. He always left early, sometimes before the sun even came up. Another big meeting or urgent deal that couldn't wait. I didn't mind his absence, not really. After nearly 12 years of marriage, the spark between us had dimmed to a faint flicker. We didn't fight, but we didn't talk much either. We'd settled into a routine, polite conversations over dinner, the occasional movie on the couch. Separate bedrooms most nights. Cole had moved back in a few months ago, shortly after finishing college. He wasn't like Walter. Where my husband was all sharp suits and stern expressions, Cole was relaxed, casual, almost boyish in his charm. He had a lazy confidence about him, the kind that came from knowing you were good-looking and charismatic. He was tall, lean but muscular, with sandy blonde hair that always looked like he just rolled out of bed. When I came downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, standing at the counter in nothing but a pair of gym shorts. He was pouring a cup of coffee, the sunlight streaming through the window, highlighting the defined lines of his back and shoulders. I hesitated for a moment, then cleared my throat as if I hadn't just been admiring him. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Morning," I replied, keeping my tone casual as I grabbed a mug from the cabinet. He turned to face me, leaning against the counter with a cocky smirk that made me instantly suspicious. "Sleep well?" His tone was light, but there was something in the way he looked at me, like he knew I hadn't. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. "Fine, thanks. You?" he shrugged. "Yeah, didn't think I'd see you last night, though." The coffee pot sputtered, breaking the silence that followed. My cheeks burned and I turned away, busying myself with sugar and cream. He wasn't saying it outright, but he didn't have to. We both knew what he meant. "I didn't mean to walk in," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "It was an accident." "Don't worry about it," he said, his smirk softening into something gentler. "It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. At least it felt like one to me. That afternoon I went to the gallery to distract myself. It was a small place, tucked into a corner of downtown, filled with overpriced paintings and sculptures that only a handful of regular clients could afford. I spent most of my shift rearranging displays and chatting with the occasional customer. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Cole. It wasn't just what I'd seen, it was the way he'd looked at me this morning. Like he was testing me, waiting to see how I'd react. It unsettled me. But it also intrigued me. When I got home, Walter's car was gone, as usual. Cole was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch with the TV on and his feet propped up on the coffee table. He looked up when I walked in, his face breaking into an easy smile. "Hey, Viv," he said. He'd taken to calling me by my first name lately. At first, it had bothered me, there was something too familiar about it, but now I found that I didn't mind. "Hey," I said, kicking off my shoes and setting my bag down. "What are you watching?" "Some stupid action movie," he said with a shrug. "Nothing you'd like." I sat down in the armchair across from him, more out of habit than anything else. I wasn't really paying attention to the TV. My eyes kept drifting to him instead. The way his t-shirt clung to his chest, the slight stubble on his jawline. He looked comfortable, relaxed, like he belonged here in a way I never quite had. "Long day?" he asked, glancing over at me. "Not really," I said. "Just quiet." "You should have stayed home," he said, his tone teasing. "I could have kept you company." I laughed, but there was an edge to his words that I couldn't ignore. I told myself I was imagining it, reading too much into an innocent comment. But then he shifted, turning toward me so that our eyes met. His expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. "You're tense," he said. "You should relax more." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. "Maybe I will." Over the next few days, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Or maybe things I'd been deliberately ignoring. The way Cole's hand would linger on my shoulder a moment too long when he passed me in the kitchen. The way his eyes followed me when I walked into a room. The way he leaned in just a little too close when we talked. And it wasn't just him. I caught myself watching him, too. Stealing glances when I thought he wasn't looking. Letting my mind wander to places it shouldn't. It wasn't just about what I'd seen in the bathroom, it was the way he made me feel. Alive. Desired. Like I was more than just Walter's wife or the woman who kept the house running. I told myself it was harmless, just a little crush, a passing fascination. But deep down, I knew better. One evening I was in the kitchen, finishing up the dishes, when Cole came in behind me. I didn't hear him at first, and when I turned around, he was so close that I almost bumped into him. "Sorry," he said, but he didn't move back. "It's fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt charged, heavy with something unsaid. His eyes flicked down to my lips, then back up to meet my gaze. I should have stepped away. I should have said something, anything, to break the tension. But I didn't. And in that moment, I realized there was no turning back. The line wasn't crossed in one grand, dramatic moment. It was a slow, deliberate unraveling, like pulling at the thread of a tightly wound sweater until it falls apart. Every glance, every touch, every word exchanged between us tugged at that thread, leaving me breathless and exposed. It started small, almost innocuous. Cole began lingering longer in the kitchen when I was there. He'd lean against the counter, watching me cook, his eyes drifting down my body in a way that was anything but casual. I tried to ignore it, but I could feel his gaze like a heat radiating through me. One evening, Walter was out of town again. Some business conference in Chicago. I'd poured myself a glass of wine and was sitting on the back patio, letting the evening breeze cool my flushed skin. Cole stepped outside, barefoot and shirtless, his gym shorts slung low on his hips. He carried a beer in one hand and a cocky grin on his face. "You're out here all by yourself?" he asked, taking a seat in the chair beside me. "Just enjoying the quiet," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Mind if I join you?" I shook my head, though I knew I should have said yes. His presence was dangerous, intoxicating, but I couldn't bring myself to send him away. We sat in silence for a while, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. The cicadas hummed in the background, a soft, rhythmic soundtrack to my racing thoughts. "You don't talk much about yourself," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced at him, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Just, you're always taking care of everyone else. Walter, this house, everything. But I don't think I've ever heard you talk about what you want." The question caught me off guard. What did I want? I'd spent so many years putting everyone else first that I wasn't sure I knew the answer anymore. I don't know, I said finally. I guess I don't think about it much. You should, he said, his voice low and serious. You deserve to have something for yourself. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I forgot about all the reasons this was wrong. He wasn't just my stepson. He was a man, a young, confident, undeniably attractive man who made me feel things I hadn't felt in years. The first kiss happened a week later. Walter had left for an early morning meeting, and Cole and I were alone in the kitchen. I was standing by the sink, rinsing off the breakfast dishes, when I felt him behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel his presence, the warmth of his body just inches from mine. You're too good at this, he said, his voice soft and teasing. At what? I asked, turning my head slightly. Taking care of everyone. Cleaning up after us, being perfect all the time. I laughed, though it came out shaky. Someone has to. He reached out then, his fingers brushing against my wrist as I set a plate on the drying rack. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly I turned to face him, and suddenly the space between us felt unbearably small. His eyes searched mine, as if waiting for permission, and I hated how badly I wanted to give it. This is wrong, I whispered, but my voice lacked conviction. I don't care, he said. And then he kissed me. His lips were warm and insistent, his hands gripping my waist as he pulled me closer. I should have pushed him away, but instead I melted into him, my fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was desperate, hungry, years of longing and frustration pouring out all at once. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathing hard. His forehead rested against mine, his hands still on my waist. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I didn't. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't control. We were careful at first, stealing kisses in the shadows of the house, touching each other only when we were sure we wouldn't be caught. But the secrecy only made it more thrilling. Every brush of his hand, every stolen moment, felt like a forbidden indulgence I couldn't get enough of. It wasn't long before we stopped holding back. One evening, after Walter had gone to bed early, Cole found me in the laundry room. I was folding towels, my back to the door, when I felt his arms wrap around my waist. I gasped, my hands freezing mid-fold as he pressed his lips to the curve of my neck. Cole, I whispered, but there was no protest in my voice. I've been thinking about you all day, he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. My resolve crumbled, as it always did around him. I turned in his arms, letting him kiss me, his hands sliding under my shirt to caress my bare skin. The laundry room was cramped and poorly lit, but in that moment it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, wanted, alive, reckless. We didn't just confine ourselves to the house. One afternoon, he convinced me to meet him at the art gallery after hours. I hesitated at first, knowing how risky it was, but the thought of being alone with him somewhere other than home was too tempting to resist. The gallery was dimly lit, the faint glow of the security lights casting long shadows on the walls. He was waiting for me by the back entrance, his expression unreadable. You sure about this? I asked as I stepped inside. He didn't answer. Instead, he took my hand and led me to the small office in the back. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly, we were on each other, his lips on mine, his hands sliding under my dress. The thrill of being in such a public place, of knowing we could be caught at any moment, only heightened the intensity of it. Afterward, as we lay tangled together on the small office couch, I traced lazy circles on his chest and tried not to think about the consequences of what we'd just done. As the days turned into weeks, the affair consumed us. Every glance, every touch, every whispered word felt like adding fuel to a fire that neither of us wanted to put out. I told myself it was just physical. A way to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside me for years. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It wasn't just about the way he touched me or the way he made me feel. It was the way he looked at me. Like I was the only woman in the world. It was the way he listened when I talked, the way he made me laugh, the way he reminded me of the person I used to be before life had worn me down. But even as I let myself fall deeper into him, a part of me knew it couldn't last. Secrets like ours never stayed hidden for long, and the more reckless we became, the closer we came to being caught. The fire we'd started was growing out of control. It wasn't just the way Cole would steal a kiss when no one was looking. or the way I'd sneak into his room late at night when Walter was snoring down the hall. It was the constant craving. The way my thoughts drifted to him when I should have been focusing on work. The way his texts would light up my phone and send a thrill through me, even in the middle of a conversation with someone else. We were bold, almost reckless. The secrecy made it electric, but the more we gave in to our desires, the less careful we became. One night, while Walter was away on a 3-day business trip, Cole and I ventured to the guest house behind the property. It was an old space, mostly used for storage now, but it had once been a cozy retreat, complete with a kitchenette, a small living area, and a bed that hadn't been slept in for years. He led me there after dinner, his hand tugging mine with that confident smile he always wore when he wanted something. "No one will bother us here," he said, as we stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and aged wood, but neither of us cared. The second the door closed, he had me pressed against it, his lips devouring mine, his hands sliding under the hem of my blouse. "I've been thinking about this all day," he murmured, his voice low and husky. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My breath hitched as he pushed me toward the bed, his movements urgent but deliberate, his lips trailing down my neck. There was something intoxicating about being in a place so close to home, yet completely removed from it. The bed creaked under our weight, the dim light from the single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. For a moment, it felt like we were the only two people in the world. But the world had a way of creeping back in. The next morning, as I was walking back to the main house, I saw Elaine, our nosy neighbor, standing on the edge of her property with a watering can in hand. She waved, her smile overly friendly, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach twist. "Good morning, Vivienne," she called out. "Morning," I replied, forcing a smile. "Didn't know anyone still used the guest house," she said, her tone light but probing. "Thought it was just collecting dust these days." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment longer, then she turned back to her flowers, humming softly to herself. I walked inside, my heart pounding. Had she seen us? Was she just fishing for information? Either way, the encounter left me rattled. Elaine wasn't the only problem. The gallery was hosting a small private event one evening, and I'd been busy all day preparing for it. By the time the guests began arriving, I was running on autopilot, greeting clients and making small talk, while my thoughts remained elsewhere. And then Cole showed up. I hadn't invited him, of course, but there he was, leaning casually against the bar in a crisp button-down shirt that made him look older than his years. When our eyes met across the room, my heart skipped a beat. "What are you doing here?" I hissed when I managed to pull him aside. "I wanted to see you," he said, his voice low and playful. "You're always busy here, so I figured I'd come to you." "This isn't the time," I said, glancing around nervously. "Relax," he said, his hand brushing against mine in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. "No one knows anything." But I wasn't so sure. I could feel Elaine's eyes on me, and I swore I saw her whispering to another guest while glancing in our direction. Later that night, after the event had ended and the guests had gone, Cole stayed behind to help me clean up. The tension between us was palpable, and it wasn't long before we were tangled together in the small storage room, his hands lifting my skirt as my back pressed against the shelves. It was thrilling, forbidden, and utterly reckless. The more time we spent together, the more possessive Cole became. It started with little things. He'd ask who I was texting or why I hadn't answered his calls. At first, I thought it was sweet, a sign that he cared. But as the weeks went on, his jealousy became harder to ignore. One evening, I came home from the gallery to find him waiting for me in the living room. Walter was still at work, as usual, and the house was eerily quiet. "Who's Adam?" he asked, holding up my phone. "What?" I asked, confused. "You got a text from someone named Adam," he said, his tone accusatory. "Who is he?" I snatched the phone from his hand, my annoyance flaring. "He's a client. We were discussing a painting he wants to buy. That's it." He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "I don't like the idea of other men texting you," he said finally. His words sent a chill through me, but I brushed it off. "You're being ridiculous," I said, walking past him toward the kitchen. But his jealousy didn't stop there. Things took a darker turn one afternoon when Walter's secretary, Clara, came by the house unexpectedly. She was dropping off some documents for Walter, who was in the middle of a conference call. I invited her in, offering her a glass of water while she waited. Cole walked into the room, his expression darkening when he saw her sitting at the kitchen table. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone sharp. "This is Clara," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Walter's secretary." He didn't respond, but the tension in the room was palpable. Clara seemed oblivious, chatting politely while Cole stood there, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving her. After she left, he turned to me, his voice low and angry. "I don't trust her." "Cole, she's just doing her job," I said, exasperated. "She's always here when Walter's not," he said. "Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I'd had my suspicions about Clara for months. Walter was careful, but I wasn't blind. The cracks in our arrangement were beginning to show. Cole's possessiveness was becoming harder to ignore, and Walter's increasingly secretive behavior only added to the strain. I was caught in the middle, trying to balance a web of lies that was growing more tangled by the day. And then Elaine dropped the bombshell. She came to the house one afternoon, holding a manila envelope. Her smile was tight, her eyes cold as she handed it to me. "You might want to take a look at this," she said before walking away. Inside the envelope were photos, grainy, poorly lit, but unmistakable. Me and Cole in the guest house, in the gallery, in his bedroom. My stomach dropped. Elaine had seen everything, and now she held all the cards. The manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter, a ticking time bomb. My hands trembled as I sifted through the photos, my stomach twisting tighter with each one. Elaine's shadowy figure must have been lurking for weeks, snapping these at just the right moment. The last photo was the worst, taken through the guest house window. It showed me sitting on the bed, Cole leaning over me, his face buried in my neck. There was no denying what was happening. I felt the room spin as Elaine's smug face replayed in my mind. Her final words echoed, "We all have secrets, Vivienne. But some secrets are more expensive than others." Elaine's terms came the next morning. She cornered me in the driveway as I was leaving for the gallery, holding a cup of coffee and a sickly sweet smile. "You're going to sell me that Cranston painting," she said, cutting straight to the point. My stomach lurched. The Cranston was the gallery's centerpiece, a prized, six-figure abstract piece I'd curated for months to bring in the wealthiest clientele. "Elaine, I can't just—" "You can," she interrupted. Her smile widened, showing too many teeth. "You will, because if you don't, Walter and the entire town will see what you've been up to with that stepson of yours. And let's face it, Vivienne, you're not exactly the forgiving type." She had me. There was no point arguing. If Walter found out, I'd lose everything. The house, my marriage, my already fragile reputation. And worse, Cole's life would be ruined before it had even begun. "Fine," I said, my voice hollow. "I'll arrange the sale." "Good girl," she said, patting my shoulder, like a condescending teacher. I clenched my fists as she walked away, my chest burning with humiliation and rage. That evening, the blackmail was still gnawing at me as I poured myself a second glass of wine. Walter was in his office upstairs, his phone glued to his ear as usual. But this time, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Elaine wasn't wrong. Walter's late nights and urgent business trips had started long before Cole and I had crossed any lines. Fueled by desperation and anger, I crept upstairs to his office, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. His briefcase sat open on the desk, a stack of papers neatly organized inside. But it wasn't the papers that caught my attention. It was his phone, buzzing with a message from Clara. "Can't stop thinking about last night. See you tomorrow?" My hand tightened around the edge of the desk as bile rose in my throat. So it was true. Walter wasn't just neglectful, he was a liar. The knowledge should have made me feel justified, vindicated even. But instead, it left me cold. I couldn't think about it now. Not with Elaine's threats hanging over my head and Cole waiting for me downstairs. The boiling point came 2 nights later. I'd stayed late at the gallery, finalizing the paperwork to sell the Cranston to Elaine for a fraction of its worth. When I arrived home, I found Cole pacing in the kitchen, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. "Where were you?" he demanded as I set down my bag. "At work," I said, too exhausted to match his intensity. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" he snapped. Elaine just stopped by. My blood ran cold. What did she say? She asked a lot of questions, he said, his voice rising. About the guest house, about us. She knows, doesn't she? Keep your voice down, I hissed, glancing toward the stairs. Vivienne, answer me, he shouted. Before I could respond, Walter appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and irritation. What the hell is going on here? Cole froze, his anger replaced by panic. I stepped between them, trying to keep my voice calm. Nothing, Walter. Cole's just upset about something at work. Don't lie to me, Walter said, his voice icy. I've been suspicious for weeks. The way you two act around each other. What are you hiding? I opened my mouth to respond, but Cole beat me to it. Why don't you ask Clara? He spat, his voice dripping with venom. Walter's face hardened, his eyes narrowing. What did you just say? You heard me, Cole said, stepping closer. You're not exactly innocent in all this, are you? The room crackled with tension, Walter's anger rising to match Cole's. And then it happened. Walter lunged forward, shoving Cole back against the counter. You little bastard. Stop it, I screamed, grabbing Walter's arm. But it was too late. Cole pushed back, harder than he intended, and Walter stumbled. His foot caught on the edge of the rug, and he fell backward, his head striking the edge of the counter with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything went still. Walter lay crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head. Cole stared at him in horror, his chest heaving. Oh my God, I whispered, dropping to my knees beside Walter. He's breathing, Cole said, his voice shaky. Call 911, I said, my hands trembling as I pressed a towel to Walter's head. I never meant for him to see me like that. Standing in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile floor, I was fussing with the zipper of a new dress. It was crimson, brighter than anything I'd dared wear in years, and the fabric clung to curves I wasn't entirely sure I still wanted to flaunt. A sudden pang of doubt had struck as I smoothed the hem over my hips. The years hadn't been unkind, not exactly, but time always leaves its mark, doesn't it? Wrinkles near my eyes. A softness where there used to be tautness. I sighed, frustrated, craning my arm awkwardly to reach the zipper which had stubbornly snagged halfway up my back. The dress had been an impulsive purchase, something I'd picked up while wandering through the mall on a whim. It felt silly now, buying a dress with no occasion to wear it, no one to wear it for. Still, for the first time in what felt like forever, I wanted to feel beautiful, desirable, alive. That's when I heard the door. The click of the lock followed by heavy footsteps. My heart jumped, and before I could even turn around, his voice echoed through the quiet house. Hey, I'm back. I froze. My stepson Nathan. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. He'd said he'd be gone all weekend visiting friends, leaving me to my solitude and the usual routine of quiet dinners and books in bed. I hurriedly tried to pull the zipper up again, but it wouldn't budge. The thought of him walking in and seeing me like this, half-dressed, fumbling with my clothes, made my face flush. But it was too late. Nathan appeared in the doorway, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. His tall frame filled the space, and his dark hair was damp, as if he'd been caught in the rain. His eyes landed on me immediately, and the air seemed to shift. For a moment, neither of us said anything. His gaze lingered, and I felt acutely aware of everything. The tightness of the dress against my skin, the undone zipper exposing the bare line of my back, the way my breath hitched as his eyes moved just briefly down my figure before snapping back up to my face. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, he said finally, his voice low and edged with something I couldn't quite place. You're home early, I stammered, turning away slightly, my hands fumbling behind me as I tried once again to fix the zipper. My heart was pounding now, a mix of embarrassment and something else, a warmth that I refused to name. Yeah, plans fell through, he replied, stepping further into the room. What's the occasion? He nodded toward the dress, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. No occasion, I said quickly. Too quickly. Just trying something on. His smile widened, but he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he set his bag down and crossed his arms, leaning casually against the counter. It looks good on you, he said, his tone casual but sincere. I felt my cheeks heat even more. Thank you, I murmured, still facing away from him, still wrestling with the zipper. Here, he said, and before I could protest, I felt him behind me. Close, too close. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the zipper, and I froze, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. You don't have to. It's fine, he interrupted gently. His voice was steady, reassuring, but there was a softness to it that made my breath catch. Just hold still. I obeyed, standing motionless as his fingers worked the zipper free. His touch was light, careful, and I couldn't help but notice the contrast between his calloused hands and the delicate fabric of the dress. It was over in seconds. He zipped it all the way up with a final tug, but those few moments felt like an eternity. There, he said, stepping back. All fixed. I turned to face him, unsure of what to say. His eyes met mine, and for the first time, I noticed how much he'd changed. He wasn't the lanky teenager who used to sulk around the house anymore. He was a man now, broad-shouldered, self-assured, with an easy charm that made people gravitate toward him. Thanks, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Anytime, he replied, his gaze lingering just a second too long before he grabbed his bag and headed for the stairs. I'll let you get back to it. As soon as he was out of sight, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My hands trembled slightly as I smoothed the fabric of the dress again, my mind racing. It was nothing, I told myself, just a moment of awkwardness, a silly misunderstanding. But as I stood there in the quiet kitchen, the warmth of his hand still lingering on my skin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something I wasn't ready to face. Dinner wasn't planned. It rarely was these days. Cooking for one had become second nature, after years of practice, and tonight was no different. I'd been preparing a simple meal, pan-seared salmon, roasted vegetables, and a glass of white wine to keep me company. But Nathan's unexpected return added a new layer to the evening. I hadn't expected to feel so self-conscious with him sitting at the kitchen table. His presence filled the room, his easy smile and casual demeanor at odds with the turmoil in my chest. As I moved around the kitchen, I felt his eyes on me. Not staring, not invasive, but watchful in a way that made me hyper-aware of every motion. You don't have to fuss over me, he said, leaning back in his chair with an amused grin. I'm not fussing, I replied, sliding the pan of salmon into the oven. My voice was steady, but inside, I felt anything but. You've got to eat, don't you? I could have grabbed something, he said, shrugging. But I'm not complaining. You're a better cook than I am. I glanced at him over my shoulder. That's not saying much. You used to burn toast when you were a teenager. He laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and for a moment it was easy to forget the strange undercurrent that had settled between us earlier. True, he admitted, shaking his head. But I've improved since then, a little. You're saying you can handle more than instant ramen now? I teased, and his grin widened. Hey, I can make a mean grilled cheese, he shot back, raising his hands in mock defense. The light-hearted exchange eased some of the tension I'd been carrying, and as I set the table, I allowed myself to relax. It was just dinner, I reminded myself. Just the two of us, like countless evenings before. But as we sat down to eat, I couldn't ignore the subtle changes. Nathan had grown into himself in ways that still caught me off guard. The boy who once slouched at the table, barely looking up from his phone, was now a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. His conversation flowed easily, his voice warm and engaging as he asked me about my day, my plans for the week, even the book I'd been reading. You always liked history, he said, nodding toward the dog-eared paperback I'd left on the counter. I did, I replied, twirling a forkful of roasted carrots. It's fascinating to see how much of the past shapes who we are. He tilted his head, considering that. You think people ever really change? Or are we all just stuck with who we are deep down? The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I think we can change, I said carefully, meeting his gaze. But it's not easy. It takes effort, and sometimes it takes someone else to push us in the right direction. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, I guess that's true. The way he looked at me then, steady, searching, made my chest tighten. It was the kind of look that saw more than I was ready to reveal, the kind of look that felt too intimate, too knowing. I cleared my throat, breaking the moment. What about you? I asked, forcing a lightness into my tone. How's work? He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. It's fine. Busy, but fine. Nothing exciting. You've been working so hard, I said, and the words came out softer than I intended. You should give yourself a break now and then. He smiled faintly, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. Maybe taking some time to figure out what I really want. Good, I said firmly. You deserve that. His smile widened, and for a moment, the air between us felt lighter. As the meal wound down, I gathered the plates and brought them to the sink, rinsing them under the warm stream of water. Nathan joined me, leaning against the counter with a dish towel in hand. You don't have to do that, I said, glancing at him. He shrugged. I don't mind. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, but when our hands brushed as I handed him a plate, I felt it again. That quiet spark, unexpected and undeniable. I pulled back quickly, turning my attention to the next dish, but my pulse had already quickened. Thanks for dinner, he said after a moment, his voice soft. You're welcome, I replied, keeping my gaze on the sink. When I finally looked up, he was watching me again, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but instead, he simply smiled and set the last dish on the drying rack. Good night, he said, his tone lingering. Good night, I murmured, my voice barely audible over the hum of the dishwasher. As I stood there alone in the quiet kitchen, I pressed my hands against the cool edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. The house felt too big, too empty, and the warmth he'd left behind seemed to echo in the silence. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if the loneliness I felt was entirely my own. The rain started late that night, a steady patter that drummed softly against the windows and filled the house with a soothing, rhythmic sound. I had settled into the living room with a cup of tea, the glow of the lamp casting a warm circle of light over my book. But I wasn't reading. I had tried. My eyes moved over the words on the page, but none of it registered. My thoughts kept drifting back to dinner, to the sound of Nathan's laugh, the way his hand had lingered over mine just long enough to make me wonder if I'd imagined it. It was nothing, I told myself again, for what felt like the 100th time that evening. He was being kind, helpful, polite. But my body refused to let the memory go, and with every passing moment, I felt more restless, more on edge. I sighed, closing the book and setting it aside. The rain outside had picked up, and a faint roll of thunder rumbled in the distance. As I stood and stretched, my gaze fell on the pile of dishes still sitting in the drying rack in the kitchen. Something to keep my hands busy, I thought. Maybe it would distract me. Padding into the kitchen, I turned on the light and started putting things away. The small, mundane motions of clearing the counter helped, at least for a moment. I was reaching for the last plate when I heard the creak of the stairs behind me. Can't sleep either? His voice startled me, low and soft, cutting through the quiet. I turned, my hand still on the plate, and found him standing in the doorway. Nathan. He was barefoot, dressed in a plain white t-shirt and loose sweatpants that hung low on his hips. His hair was slightly tousled, as if he'd just rolled out of bed, and there was a drowsy warmth in his eyes that made my breath catch. I didn't mean to scare you, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. You didn't, I replied quickly, though my heart was racing. I just couldn't sleep either, thought I'd tidy up a bit. He stepped into the kitchen, his movements unhurried. Rain keeping you up? Something like that, I said, turning back to the plate and sliding it into the cabinet. He leaned against the counter, watching me with that same steady gaze that had unsettled me earlier. You always keep yourself busy, he said, his tone thoughtful. I guess I do, I admitted, wiping my hands on a dish towel. Old habits. Nathan chuckled, a deep, quiet sound that seemed to settle in the air between us. I remember, you've always been like that. Always moving, always doing something. Dad used to say you didn't know how to sit still. The mention of his father made my chest tighten, but the way he said it, fondly, without sadness, softened the sting. Well, someone had to keep the house running, I said lightly, though my voice wavered just enough to betray me. Nathan's expression shifted, his smile fading into something gentler. You've done a lot for us, he said quietly. For me, I hope you know that. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, and I wasn't sure how to respond. I just did what I thought was right, I said finally, avoiding his gaze. Well, he said, his voice dropping slightly, it meant a lot. I looked up then, and the intensity in his eyes made my pulse quicken. There was something unspoken in the way he looked at me, something that made the air between us feel heavy and charged. I needed to break it, to put some space between us before my thoughts could spiral any further. Turning back to the counter, I reached for the dish towel I'd left there, but my fingers brushed his hand instead. I froze. It wasn't intentional, just an accidental touch, fleeting and harmless, but the sensation of his skin against mine sent a jolt through me. I pulled back quickly, muttering an apology, but he didn't move. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steady. I turned to face him again, and the look in his eyes made my breath catch. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was watching me with an intensity that was both disarming and magnetic, his gaze unwavering. "Nathan," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, cutting me off gently. His tone was calm, but there was a quiet resolve beneath it that sent a shiver down my spine. "I know this is complicated." He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, and I felt my back press against the edge of the counter. He wasn't touching me. He hadn't crossed that line. But the space between us had disappeared, and I could feel the heat of his body, the faint scent of him lingering in the air. "You don't have to say anything," he continued, his voice soft but firm. I need you to know how much you mean to me. How much you've always meant to me." His words left me speechless. My mind was racing, a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, guilt, fear, and something else, something that made my heart pound and my knees feel weak. "Nathan," I said again, my voice trembling. It's not." "I know," he said again, his gaze never leaving mine. "I just had to say it." For a moment, neither of us moved. The storm outside had quieted, leaving only the sound of the rain and the faint hum of the refrigerator. And then, just as quickly as it had happened, he stepped back. The space between us returned, and the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, leaving only the echo of his words behind. "Good night," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Good night," I managed, my voice barely audible. I stayed in the kitchen long after he was gone, my hands gripping the counter as I tried to steady myself. The rain continued to fall outside, soft and unrelenting, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was washing something away, or bringing something to life. The rain hadn't let up by morning, a steady downpour that turned the yard into a blur of gray and green. The storm had settled in, thick clouds hanging low over the house, and every now and then a gust of wind rattled the windows. I sat by the living room window, sipping my second cup of coffee, my book resting forgotten in my lap. My thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the memory of last night. His voice, his words, they lingered in my mind, circling like a bird that refused to land. "How much you mean to me." I told myself not to read into it, not to let my mind go places it had no business wandering. But the way he'd looked at me, the intensity in his eyes, it wasn't something I could ignore. The sound of footsteps drew my attention, and I looked up just as Nathan entered the room. He was holding a blanket over one shoulder and balancing a bowl of cereal in his other hand. "Morning," he said, flashing me a boyish grin. His hair was damp, as if he'd just showered, and the plain black hoodie he wore clung to his broad shoulders. "Morning," I replied, my voice steady despite the flicker of nervous energy his presence seemed to bring. He dropped onto the couch across from me, tossing the blanket over the armrest before leaning back with his cereal. "Still raining, huh?" "Looks like it," I said, glancing out the window. "Guess we're stuck inside," he said with a shrug, his tone casual. "Not a bad day for it, though." I nodded, sipping my coffee, and for a moment we sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the rain filling the space between us. "You reading anything good?" he asked, nodding toward the book in my lap. "Just a novel," I said, holding it up for him to see. "Nothing too exciting." He squinted at the cover, then grinned. "History again?" "Guilty," I admitted, smiling despite myself. "You're consistent, I'll give you that," he teased, spooning another bite of cereal into his mouth. I chuckled, setting the book aside. "And what about you? What's your big plan for this rainy day?" "This," he said, gesturing to the blanket and his cereal. "I was thinking of watching a movie or something. You want to join?" I hesitated. Spending the afternoon curled up on the couch with him felt like a dangerous idea, given how unsettled I'd felt since last night. But saying no seemed equally impossible. "Sure," I said finally, keeping my tone light. What are we watching? Your pick, he said, setting his empty bowl on the coffee table and grabbing the remote. I laughed softly. I don't even know what's on. He patted the cushion beside him, his grin easy and inviting. Come on, we'll figure it out. There was nothing particularly unusual about the moment, nothing outwardly inappropriate. But as I stood and crossed the room to sit beside him, I felt my pulse quicken. The couch was big enough for space between us, but when I sat down, I realized how close we already were. Nathan pulled the blanket over both of us, his arm brushing mine as he settled back into the cushions. The warmth of his body was immediate, and I fought the urge to shift away. Comfortable? He asked, glancing at me. Fine, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. He smiled, then turned his attention to the screen, scrolling through the options. What about this? He asked, stopping on a movie I didn't recognize. Looks fine? I said, not really paying attention. The movie started, but I barely registered the opening scenes. My focus was splintered, drawn to the sound of his breathing, the faint scent of his cologne, the way his arm rested casually along the back of the couch, so close to my shoulder. At some point, the blanket slipped from my lap, and Nathan leaned forward to fix it. His hand brushed against my leg as he pulled it up, and I froze. It was nothing, a harmless, absent-minded gesture, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. You okay? He asked, his voice low. Yes, I said quickly, my cheeks flushing. He didn't press, but his hand lingered for just a moment longer before he leaned back again. As the movie played on, the tension between us felt almost unbearable. It wasn't spoken, wasn't acknowledged, but it was there, humming in the charged silence. My heart raced every time he shifted, every time his arm brushed mine, every time I caught him glancing at me out of the corner of my eye. The rain continued to fall outside, soft and steady, a constant rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. By the time the credits rolled, I felt as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. Nathan turned to me, his expression easy, as if he hadn't felt the same unbearable tension that I had. Not bad, he said, stretching his arms over his head. Yeah, I murmured, forcing a smile. As he stood and gathered the blanket, I stayed on the couch, watching the rain streak down the window. The quiet weight of the afternoon still pressed heavily against me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. Something neither of us knew how to stop. The house was dark and quiet, save for the faint patter of rain still falling outside. It was past midnight, but sleep was impossible. I had tossed and turned for hours, my mind tangled in knots, my body restless beneath the weight of too many unspoken thoughts. Eventually, I gave up. Throwing back the covers, I padded down the hallway in my robe, the soft fabric tied loosely around my waist. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water or the simple act of moving might settle me. The faint glow of the refrigerator light spilled across the floor as I opened the door, the cool air brushing against my skin. I stood there for a moment, staring blankly at the rows of bottles and containers, not really looking for anything, when I heard it. The creak of the floorboards behind me. I turned, startled, and saw Nathan standing in the doorway. He was barefoot, dressed in the same t-shirt and sweatpants he'd worn earlier, his hair still tousled from sleep. His expression was soft, his eyes heavy-lidded, but there was a flicker of surprise when he saw me. Couldn't sleep? He asked, his voice low and quiet. No, I admitted, closing the fridge. You? He shook his head, stepping into the room. Not really. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched out, not uncomfortable but charged, the kind of silence that felt heavy with everything unsaid. I busied myself by grabbing a glass from the cabinet and filling it with water, my back turned to him. But even with the distance between us, I felt his presence like a weight in the air, solid and unyielding. You've been quiet today, he said suddenly, his tone careful. I turned to face him, holding the glass in both hands. Have I? He nodded, leaning against the counter across from me. More than usual. I looked down at the water, the cool surface rippling slightly as I shifted my grip. I've just had a lot on my mind. Like what? His question hung in the air, simple but loaded, and for a moment I didn't know how to answer. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and unrelenting, and the urge to deflect, to change the subject, was almost overwhelming. But something in his tone, in the quiet way he asked, made me hesitate. It's hard to explain, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Try me, he said, and the softness in his voice nearly undid me. I looked up at him then, and the sincerity in his expression, the openness, the quiet patience, made my chest ache. He wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding, but he wasn't going to let me hide either. It's just, I hesitated, searching for the right words. Sometimes I feel like I've forgotten how to let people in, how to let myself feel things. Nathan frowned, his brow furrowing slightly. You don't think you feel things? No, I do, I said quickly. But it's complicated. It's easier to bury things, to keep moving, than to stop and actually deal with them. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than he let on. I get that, he said quietly. Do you? I asked, my voice soft but edged with curiosity. His gaze flickered, and for a moment I thought he might look away. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us until there was only the counter between us. I do, he said, his voice steady. It's easier to pretend you're okay, to keep things bottled up, than to risk whatever happens when you let it all out. The way he said it, the quiet conviction in his tone, made my heart ache. There was more to his words than he was saying, more to the look in his eyes than I could understand. Nathan, I began, but he cut me off, his voice firm but gentle. Let me finish, he said, taking a deep breath. I've been keeping things in for a long time. I thought I could just ignore them, move on, act like they didn't matter. But I can't anymore. My pulse quickened, my breath catching as his words sank in. What are you trying to say? I asked, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, his jaw tightening, and I could see the struggle in his expression, the push and pull of everything he wanted to say and everything he was afraid to admit. I care about you, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. More than I should, more than I ever expected to. His confession hit me like a wave, the weight of his words crashing over me and leaving me breathless. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. I know it's not fair, he continued, his tone quieter now, almost apologetic. I know it's complicated, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel this way. The vulnerability in his voice, the raw honesty, made my chest tighten. I could feel my own emotions bubbling to the surface, the years of loneliness, of yearning, crashing against the walls I'd built around myself. Nathan, I said softly, shaking my head. This isn't. I know, he said, cutting me off again. I know it's not simple, and I know what you're gonna say, but I needed you to know. For a moment, the room was silent, the rain outside the only sound. I could feel the tears stinging at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away, my hands trembling slightly as I set the glass down on the counter. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice breaking. You don't have to say anything, he said, his gaze unwavering. I needed to be honest with you. His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and I felt something inside me shift, something I couldn't ignore. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving behind a heavy mist that clung to the windows and softened the light spilling into the kitchen. But the house didn't feel lighter. If anything, the air inside was thicker, weighed down by the memory of Nathan's confession. I had spent most of the day avoiding him, retreating to my room under the guise of cleaning out old boxes. In truth, I hadn't touched a single thing. I couldn't. His words echoed in my head, over and over, refusing to give me peace, more than I should. The weight of it sat in my chest like a stone, pulling at every corner of my thoughts. I told myself it was just the vulnerability of the moment, the late hour, the rain-soaked quiet that had loosened his tongue. But a deeper part of me knew that wasn't true. There had been too much honesty in his voice, too much certainty in his eyes. By mid-afternoon, I gave up on pretending. I wandered downstairs, restless, hoping to find something, anything, to occupy my hands, to drown out the noise in my head. But as I stepped into the living room, I stopped short. Nathan was there. He was sitting on the couch, his elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed. He hadn't noticed me yet, and for a moment, I considered slipping back upstairs. But something in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were clasped tightly together, made me stay. Nathan? He looked up, startled, and for a brief moment, his expression was open, raw. Then it shifted, his face smoothing into something calmer, more controlled. Hey, he said, leaning back against the couch. Everything okay? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shrugged, a small, half-hearted gesture. Yeah, just thinking. I hesitated, the silence between us stretching out like a taut wire. Finally, I moved closer, perching on the edge of the armchair across from him. "About last night?" I asked quietly. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. "Yeah." I wanted to say something, anything that might ease the tension between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself watching him, the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers flexed against each other. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. "I didn't mean to make things weird." "You didn't," I said quickly, though the lie felt heavy on my tongue. He looked up then, his eyes meeting mine, and the intensity in his gaze made my breath catch. "I did," he said firmly, "and I'm sorry for that, but I'm not sorry for being honest." The conviction in his voice sent a shiver through me, and I felt my defenses faltering, the carefully constructed walls I had spent years building beginning to crack. "Nathan, this is complicated," I said, my voice trembling. "I know," he said, his tone softer now, "but that doesn't make it any less real." I opened my mouth to respond, to say something, anything, that might diffuse the moment, but he stood before I could speak. "Let me show you something," he said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Before I could ask what he meant, he walked over to the window and gestured for me to join him. Reluctantly, I stood, my steps slow and uncertain as I crossed the room. When I reached him, he turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Do you remember when we planted that tree?" he asked, nodding toward the oak in the yard. I glanced out the window, the memory surfacing unbidden. "Of course," I said softly. It had been years ago, not long after I'd married his father. Nathan had been a teenager then, all gangly limbs and quiet defiance. We had planted the tree together as a family, the three of us digging into the soil, laughing and teasing each other as we worked. "It was supposed to be Dad's tree," Nathan said, his voice distant. "But now every time I see it, I think of you." I looked at him, startled by the admission. "I think about how you were always the one holding everything together," he continued, his gaze fixed on the tree. "Even when it wasn't easy. Even when I didn't make it easy. Nathan." He turned to me then, his eyes searching mine. "I don't know when it happened," he said quietly, "but somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of you as just Dad's wife, and I know it's not fair to put this on you, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "This isn't," I began, my voice faltering. "Nathan, we can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "Because it's wrong," I said, my voice trembling. "Is it?" he asked, stepping closer. "Or are we just scared of what people might think?" His proximity made it impossible to think, his words cutting through every excuse, every rationalization I had clung to. "Nathan, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine, and I could see the conflict in his expression, the push and pull of everything he was feeling. But then he reached for me, his hand brushing against mine, and the touch sent a shockwave through me. It was a simple gesture, a fleeting contact, but it was enough to shatter the fragile barrier between us. The moment his hand touched mine, the world seemed to fall away. The sounds of the house, the faint rustle of the wind outside, all of it disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his skin against mine. It was such a simple thing, such a small gesture, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between us. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything, that would put an end to this before it could go any further. But I couldn't. I stood there, frozen as his fingers brushed mine again, lingering just long enough to make my pulse quicken. My heart was pounding in my chest, a wild, erratic rhythm that I couldn't control. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice trembling. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were afraid to startle me. His hand slid up my arm, his touch light but firm, and I felt a shiver run through me. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his voice steady and calm. "Just tell me to stop, and I will." I opened my mouth, but no words came. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, guilt, longing, all colliding in a chaotic storm that left me unable to think clearly. He took another step, closing the distance between us until I could feel the heat of his body. His hand moved to my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against my skin, and the tenderness of the gesture made my breath catch. "You mean so much to me," he murmured, his eyes locked on mine. "More than you'll ever know." Tears stung at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away, my hands trembling at my sides. "This isn't right," I said weakly, but even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow. "Maybe not," he said quietly, his thumb still tracing gentle circles on my cheek. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" I couldn't answer. My mind was screaming at me to pull away, to put an end to this before it could spiral any further out of control. But my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch, drawn to the warmth and the comfort he offered. Before I could think better of it, his lips brushed against mine. It was tentative at first, almost hesitant, as if he were giving me one last chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I let myself sink into the kiss, my eyes fluttering shut as the tension between us broke like a dam. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and desperate. It was as though all the emotions we had been holding back, the fear, the longing, the confusion, poured out in that single, unrestrained moment. His lips were warm and insistent, his touch firm yet reverent, and I found myself clinging to him, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt. "Nathan," I breathed against his lips, the sound of his name trembling with both a plea and a surrender. He pulled back slightly, just enough to meet my gaze, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me to stop," he said again, his voice raw. "Tell me, and I'll walk away. I swear I will." I should have told him. I should have said the words that would have ended this. But the look in his eyes, the vulnerability, the longing, it undid me. "I can't," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I can't." The admission was all he needed. His hand slid down to my waist, pulling me against him, and I felt his breath hitch as I responded in kind, my arms wrapping around his neck. He kissed me again, harder this time, his lips moving with an urgency that sent a spark of heat coursing through me. I felt myself backing up, my legs hitting the edge of the couch, and then we were sinking into the cushions. His weight pressing me down, in a way that felt both overwhelming and impossibly right. His hands roamed carefully, reverently, tracing the curve of my hip, the line of my thigh, as though he were memorizing every inch of me. My robe fell open, the loose knot at my waist coming undone, and I shivered as his fingers brushed against bare skin. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted to protest, to tell him he was wrong, but the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, made it impossible to argue. He made me feel beautiful, in a way I hadn't felt in years. His lips traveled from my mouth to my jaw, then down to the sensitive skin of my neck, and I couldn't suppress the soft gasp that escaped me. My fingers tangled in his hair, holding him close, as every nerve in my body seemed to come alive under his touch. Time seemed to blur, each moment melting into the next, until all that existed was the two of us. The soft hum of his breath against my skin, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palms, the overwhelming sense of being wanted, cherished. It was only when we both lay still, the heat of the moment fading into a quiet intimacy, that the weight of what had just happened began to settle over me. Nathan's arms were still wrapped around me, his face buried in the crook of my neck, and I could feel his breath, slow and steady, against my skin. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "For what?" I asked, my own voice soft. "For everything," he said, pulling back just enough to meet my gaze. "For complicating things. For making this harder for you." I shook my head, tears stinging at my eyes again. "It's not just you," I said. "I'm just as responsible." The truth of it hung between us, unspoken but undeniable, and as we lay there, tangled together on the couch, I felt both the weight of what we'd done and the warmth of what we'd shared. The pale light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the walls of the living room in muted golds and grays. I woke to the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air, mingling with something warmer, more tangible, him. Nathan's arm was draped around me, his breathing deep and even, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. I lay still, unwilling to move, unwilling to break the fragile spell that had settled over us in the quiet hours of the night. But as the light grew stronger, the weight of reality began to press against me, relentless and unavoidable. The warmth of his body, the way his hand rested lightly on my waist, it wasn't just comforting. It was a reminder. What had we done? My chest tightened as the memories of last night came rushing back in vivid detail. The look in his eyes, the way his voice had trembled when he said my name, the way I had let myself fall into his arms despite every warning bell in my head. I closed my eyes, a wave of guilt crashing over me, and slowly began to pull away. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He stirred, his brow furrowing slightly as his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he looked at me as if he didn't quite remember where he was. But then his gaze softened, a small, sleepy smile curving his lips. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. I couldn't bring myself to return the smile. "We need to talk." The words were like a splash of cold water, and I saw the shift in his expression, the way the warmth in his eyes dimmed as reality began to sink in for him too. "Yeah," he said quietly, sitting up and running a hand through his tousled hair. I pulled the robe tighter around me, suddenly feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with my appearance. I sat on the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, and stared down at the floor as I searched for the right words. "This can't happen again," I said finally, my voice trembling. Nathan didn't respond right away. When I glanced at him, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between sadness and resolve. "Why not?" he asked softly. His question caught me off guard and I hesitated, my thoughts racing. "Because it's not right," I said. "Because it's complicated. You're my stepson, Nathan." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "I'm not a kid anymore, you know that." "That doesn't change anything," I said, my voice breaking. "People wouldn't understand." "Do you care what they think?" he asked, his tone sharp but not unkind. "Or are you just scared?" His words hit me like a blow, and I felt a flush of anger rise in my chest. Anger at him for saying it, and anger at myself because I knew there was truth in what he said. "Of course I'm scared," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "This isn't just about me, Nathan. This affects you too, your family, your future, everything." He stood then, pacing the room, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You're making it sound like I don't know what I'm doing," he said, his voice low. "Like I haven't thought about this. But I have. For months, and I'm not saying it'll be easy, but you're worth it." His words made my heart ache, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. The vulnerability in his voice, the quiet conviction, it was almost too much to bear. "Nathan," I said softly, standing and reaching for him. "You don't know what you're asking." He turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I'm asking for a chance," he said. "A chance to prove that this doesn't have to be wrong, that we don't have to let other people's expectations define us." Tears stung at my eyes, and I shook my head, my voice trembling. "You deserve someone who can give you everything, Nathan. Someone who doesn't come with all this baggage." "I don't care about that," he said, stepping closer. "You're everything I want. Don't you see that?" The raw emotion in his voice, the way he looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered, it was overwhelming. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted, my voice breaking. "Then don't decide now," he said, his tone softening. "Just think about it. That's all I'm asking." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The morning light spilled into the room, illuminating the space between us, and I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. "I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded, his expression a mix of hope and resignation. "Take all the time you need," he said quietly. He stepped back, giving me space, and I felt both relief and a strange sense of loss as the distance between us grew. As he turned and walked toward the stairs, I stood there in the quiet, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, fear, and something else. Something I wasn't ready to name. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving me alone in the golden light of the morning, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find the strength to make the choice that lay ahead. The house was quiet again, the kind of stillness that settles in when everyone else has gone about their day. Nathan had left the house an hour ago, saying he needed some air, leaving me with the echoes of his words and the weight of my own thoughts. I sat in the small nook by the kitchen window, a steaming cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and stared out at the backyard. The oak tree stood tall in the center of the yard, its branches stretching wide and strong, droplets of rain still clinging to its leaves. It had grown so much over the years, its roots pushing deep into the soil, its trunk thick and steady. I thought of the day we'd planted it, the hope it had symbolized then. I closed my eyes, letting the memory wash over me. Nathan had been just a boy back then, his face still soft with the remnants of childhood. He'd sulked about being dragged into yard work, but by the end of the day his laughter had rung through the air as he patted down the soil with his hands, his cheeks smudged with dirt. It was so easy to remember him that way, to cling to the version of him that was safe and uncomplicated. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He wasn't a boy. He hadn't been for a long time. I opened my eyes and sighed, my fingers tightening around the mug. Nathan's words replayed in my mind, over and over. I'm asking for a chance to prove this doesn't have to be wrong. What would that even look like? A life where we stopped pretending, where we stopped hiding. I thought about the whispers, the judgment, the way people would look at us if they ever knew. I thought about the risk of losing him altogether, of driving him away if I refused to acknowledge the truth of what had grown between us. But more than that, I thought about what it would mean for me. For years I'd told myself that my role was to care for others, to be the steady one, the reliable one. I had been a wife, a stepmother, a caretaker, but I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted, not really. Not since his father had passed. And now here I was, standing at a crossroads I hadn't expected, faced with a choice that felt impossible. I set the mug down on the table and pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to make sense of the storm raging inside me. It wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about us. It was about everything I had denied myself for so long. The warmth of his touch, the way he had looked at me last night, the way he had made me feel wanted, seen, alive. It had shaken something loose in me, something I hadn't even realized I'd been missing. And yet, the fear lingered. What if we were wrong? What if this was just a fleeting moment, something born out of loneliness and longing? What if giving in to this would only lead to more pain, for both of us? I didn't have the answers. The sound of the front door opening pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up as Nathan stepped into the room, his hair damp from the mist outside, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said quietly, his voice careful. You're not, I replied, my voice just as soft. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the cup of tea on the table, before he stepped closer. I just wanted to check on you, he said. Make sure you're okay. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure it was true. I'm fine. The silence between us stretched out thick with everything we weren't saying. I could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands curled into loose fists at his sides, as if he were bracing himself for something. Nathan, I began, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me, his eyes filled with that same raw honesty that had undone me last night. Yeah? I took a deep breath, my hands clenching in my lap. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know if this is something we can ever really have. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. But, he prompted, his voice low. But I can't ignore how I feel, I admitted, my voice breaking. I don't know what that means yet, but I know I can't pretend it isn't there. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then he stepped closer, his movements careful, as if he were afraid of scaring me off. That's all I needed to hear, he said quietly. I felt the tears welling up again, and I looked away, blinking them back. This isn't going to be easy, I said, my voice shaking. I'm not afraid of hard, he said, his tone firm. I'm afraid of losing you. The sincerity in his voice broke something in me, and I felt a sob rise in my throat. He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady, and I let him take it, my fingers trembling in his. For a long moment we just stood there, the silence between us filled with all the things we couldn't yet say. I don't know what happens next, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Neither do I, he replied, his thumb brushing against the back of my hand. But we'll figure it out, together. His words settled over me like a promise, fragile but unyielding, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to hope. As the morning light spilled across the room, I held onto his hand a little tighter, letting the warmth of it steady me. Whatever came next, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But for now, in this quiet moment, I let myself believe that it might just be worth it.